Enjoy. Welcome to week 2 of your Pacific Northwest Sports Update. This week was absolutely crazy. Let's dive into it. First off, we had UW versus Tulsa. UW won this game 43-10. Okay, another dominant win for the Huskies. UW's yet to play anyone of note, but we shouldn't count that against them when we speak about how good this team is. Penix was his usual self. He went 28 of 38 for 409 yards, 3 touchdowns, and an interception. Roman Dunze was his usual self as well. He hauled in 7 catches for 170 yards and ran in a touchdown off of a reverse. The downside of this UW team is the running game. Against Tulsa, they managed 109 yards, but take away 2 different wide receiver reverses and a couple scrambles by Penix, and Washington's running backs only combined for 409 rushing yards. That is a big deal. You could not win a national title without the run game. Now, Kalen DeBar's won a bunch of games, and he is an amazing coach. There's no denying that. But you can only put up so many godly passing numbers before you end up losing games. I mean, look at his time in Fresno State. Look at Mike Leach. Look what these pass-heavy teams have done. They put up numbers. They're impressive. They're fun to watch. But it doesn't mean anything if you can't run the damn ball. At some point, you have to be able to look at your opponent dead in the eye and go, I'm going to run here. Try and stop me. UW can't do that yet. There is a hope for them, but at this exact moment, they can't do that. I worry about what happens when UW has to play tougher opponents later in the season, and they don't have the ability to yet look at a team and say, here's where I'm going. I'm daring you to try and stop me. WSU played Wisconsin, and wow, 31-22, a giant win. Was this game not the absolute game of the week? Okay, Jake Dickert stated it best after the win over 19 Wisconsin. We deserve to be in a Power 5. Yes, they do. WSU is a dominant team, and it proved it again with an impressive win over Wisconsin. Let's dive into it, okay? Because this is crazy. At the end of the first quarter, the score 7-3. Wazoo's second quarter is what really blew this game open. WSU scored 17 to Wisconsin 6. Therefore, Wazoo went into halftime up 24-9. And with the way the defensive line was dominating, you just thought Wazoo's got this game in the bag. And maybe Wazoo did too. I have no idea what Luke Fickell said to his Wisconsin team at halftime, but clearly he said the right thing because they came out and they scored 13 points in the third quarter, completely shutting down WSU's offense. In fact, they forced them to 4 3-and-outs in that one quarter. With their 13-point third quarter, they were able to make the game 24-22 headed into the fourth. And you got the feelings where the Cougs might lose this game. Boy, was this fourth quarter a battle. WSU had to ask their defense to answer the bell multiple times. They made 3 different crucial stops. But let's talk about Cam Ward. He played absolutely out of his mind. He went 20 for 32 for 212 yards and 2 touchdowns, but he also led the Cougs in the ground rushing 17 times for 43 yards, and he was like Houdini in the pocket making some crazy escapes. In the fourth quarter, Ward had scrambles of 23 and 14 during an amazing drive that ended with Nakia Watson scoring a 1-yard plunge to exact his revenge on his former squad, Wisconsin. But if it weren't for this drive, there's a very good chance Wazoo doesn't win this game. I mean, until this moment, Wazoo's offense had nothing going for it. The player of the game, sure, you could say it's Cam Ward, but really, it's Jaden Hicks. He forced a fumble, and he had big hits all over the field. The dude's an NFL talent. Don't be surprised if you start hearing his name come up more this year, more next year, because he's going to be in the league one day. Another guy I want to give a shout out to is RJ Stone. He had 2 different strip sacks, and he really set the tone for this defense. And he's done it all year long. He did it a lot of the last year, and he's going to continue to do it for the rest of the year. He's all over the field, and when WSU needs to keep their calm, you know he can do it. Speaking of keeping calm, Wazoo needs to do that after such an emotional win and take care of business playing Northern Colorado next week. We all know who they play the week after, but you got to win next week before we can make that game a big deal. The Eastern Eagles played Fresno State, and unfortunately they lost 31-34. College football in overtime, right? What could possibly be better? Unfortunately for Eastern, it wasn't better for them. Eastern played their hearts out, but they couldn't get stops when they needed them, which ultimately led to their demise, as Fresno State's Dylan Lynch would end up taking the game-winning field goal in double overtime for the Bulldog win. There's not much to really capitalize on here. Eastern's player of the game is Justice Jackson, who had carried the ball 11 times for 79 yards. And Eastern's going to welcome Southern Eastern Louisiana into the Inferno next week for hopefully what can be their win. Over to Ellensburg, Washington. Central Football played Montana Tech and lost 29-27. It's another tough loss, and this game just it shows that, right? Central was ahead 14-13 at the end of the first quarter, and then they just traded back and forth with Montana Tech all game. No one team was really dominant in one facet. In fact, Central head coach Chris Fisk, who again we have a podcast coming out with him in the future, but he said it best. I'm disappointed in the effort we put out tonight, both in players and coaches. We'll do everything we need to do to get it fixed by next weekend. Short and simple, and that's the way to describe this game. They just couldn't get it done. Central Washington's player of the game, Tyler Flanagan, he rushed the ball 15 times for 149 yards and a touchdown, averaging 9.9 yards per carry. Montana Tech's player of the game is Blake Counts, who rushed 28 times for 127 yards, but no touchdowns. Central Washington's going to stay on Ellensburg and play Angelo State next week, where Montana Tech will welcome Eastern Oregon to Montana Tech next weekend. Pacific Lutheran Utes played Concordia College. Unfortunately, they lost 21-26. Another tough loss for the Lutes of PLU. After falling behind 7-0, the Lutes would put together a solid drive, getting all the way down to Concordia College's 9-yard line. But this is where disaster struck. Senior Rayson Montoyomo would fumble the ball away to Concordia. After falling behind 13-0, the Lutes offense was then drive 60 yards down the field to Concordia's 1-yard line. But the quarterback Chaffin lost control of the football and Concordia recovered again. Despite all of this, PLU was still in it till the very end. The Lutes defense held Concordia to a 3-and-out, forcing a punt, which culminated with the Lutes getting the ball with 1:28 left in the game. They drive 52 yards down to the 14-yard line, but they were unable to get to the end zone before time ran out. When you have games like this, it hurts because it's winnable. Despite your 2 mistakes, they score touchdowns off that. We're looking at a whole different game. But unfortunately, the player of the game goes to junior quarterback Darius Chafin. He went 26-41 for 2 touchdowns, interception, as well as a lost fumble. He also showed tremendous leadership, getting sacked on 7 different occasions, but bouncing up after every single one and loving his offensive line and making sure he wasn't getting down on them. PLU will head to California next week to play California Lutheran University. Over to the Whitworth Pirates versus Eastern Oregon. They won 42-28. The first half was actually all Mountaineers. But going into halftime, the score is 14-14. When a game looks like one side is giving their all and the other side is kind of just playing, usually that side who's just playing ends up winning those games. You can only swing so many times at Goliath before Goliath just says, we're going to do our thing. Whitworth used a huge third quarter in which they put up 21 points to get a win. Their defense also pitched a second-half shutout. Right there, Goliath decided to play. Whitworth's player of the game is quarterback Ryan Blair. After starting Austin Ewing went down, so starter Austin Ewing went down in the second half on the opening drive. Blair took over the reins and played out of his mind. He went 9 of 11 for 149 yards and 3 touchdowns. I know Ewing's more of a dual threat type guy, but it might be something to start watching out for because this offense was completely different when he was in it. And it culminated, right? 3 touchdowns in only 9 pass attempts. Eastern Oregon's player of the game, though, is sophomore linebacker Jason Grant. He had 7 tackles and a sack. The dude is a nose for the football and is someone to follow as the season goes along. Whitworth is going to head down to Orange, California next week to play Chapman, and Eastern Oregon will head to Butte, Montana to play Montana Tech. That sums up our Washington schools. On to our Oregon schools. Let's start with the Oregon Ducks. We'll jump into this game in the second half. Oregon's leading 18-13, but Texas Tech holds Oregon scoreless the entirety of the third quarter while putting up 14 points of their own. Leading into the fourth quarter, starting with the score, Texas Tech up 27-18. Remember that guy like Bo Nix? We talked about him. We said, he could be a dark horse Heisman candidate. Yeah, well, late in the third quarter to the early fourth quarter, Nix got very composed and led them on a drive that completely shifted the momentum of this game, okay? It was all Texas Tech, and then Nix did what Nix does. He went 8 of 11 for 48 yards and ran for another 17, including a crucial 13-yard scramble to convert a 3rd and 11. This drive ended with a touchdown from junior running back Bucky Irving. Nix ended up finishing the night 32 of 44 for 359 yards and 2 touchdowns. Sure, it wasn't the 81 points they put up last week, but it was a tough game in Lubbock, and they won. Oregon's player of the game, Jeffrey Bassa. He had 9 tackles, including a tackle for a loss and an interception that was returned for a touchdown to really put the icing on the cake for this game. Oregon is going to stay in Eugene next week, and they're going to play Hawaii. On to the Oregon State Beavers, right? They played UC Davis and won 55-7. Blowout. Not much to say when you win like this. They had 450 yards of offense, including 269 yards on the ground for the Beavs. I'm actually not giving out a player of the game because every single person who played for the Beavs contributed today. Damian Martinez had a touchdown, 104 rushing yards on just 7 carries. DJU tossed 2 scores and 107 yards through the air. He also scored a rushing touchdown. Easton Marceris Arnold led the Beavs with 6 tackles, while 3 different Beavs tallied an interception. OSU will face San Diego State University in Corvallis next week. Hopefully, that's another tough win. We know who they play the week after. That might very well be the playing of the game. Maybe the game of the week, excuse me. On to Portland State, who played Wyoming. They lost 17-31. But they played surprisingly well, especially after the punishment they took last week against Oregon. Nothing truly stood out in this game as Portland State was simply overmatched and Wyoming just didn't play their best football. In fact, if it weren't for Wyoming's defense coming up with stop after stop, you could easily be looking at this game and saying, wow, upset. Wyoming's player of the game is Easton Gibbs. He led Wyoming with 8 tackles and was consistently around the football. Could have had way more. The Portland State player of the game is sophomore linebacker Parker McKenna, who had 8 tackles as well. Wyoming's going to head to Austin next week to play Texas, and Portland State will stay at home next week and play North American. Over to the Western Oregon Wolves versus Lincoln, Washington. 29-14, they won. Well, Western Oregon actually scored the first 29 points of the game and cruised on from there to a 29-14 victory. This one was so dominant that Western Oregon scored on 6 of their first 7 possessions. The Western Oregon player of the game is Isaiah Abram. He had 6 tackles. 1 was for a loss. He also forced a fumble and had a fumble recovery. The Wolves will head to Port Alice, New Mexico next week to play Eastern New Mexico University. On to our George Fox Bruins versus Pacific. Big win for the Bruins. It's what you can only describe really as gritty, right? Heading into the third quarter, they're trailing 6-7. The Bruins found themselves pinned against their own end zone to start the period. Starting at the 2-yard line, the Bruins were stuffed in the end zone for a safety to further put them in a hole 6-9 now. Rather than panic, the Bruins countered. They went on a grueling 7-minute drive that ended with them scoring a touchdown on a 13-yard run. Now, the Bruins eventually got the ball back, and, they drove down the field, but they were stuck at the goal line on 4th down. Now, they went on defense, and they actually stonewalled the running back for a safety of their own. A rare game where you see not one, but 2 safeties. Now they have a 14-9 lead, and that's where the game ended. George Fox's player of the game is Demontre Thomas II. He finished 12 of 19 for 187 yards. He also rushed for 45 yards and a touchdown. The Pacific player of the game was Brody Bantolina, who had 42 yards on 6 carries. I believe if they're able to feed him more this game, you might be looking at a Pacific win. George Fox is going to head to Claremont, California to place the Claremont Mud Scripts next week. And Pacific will head to Claremont as well, but they're going to be facing Pomona Pitzer. On to your Lewis and Clark Pioneers versus Williamette. They won 38-7. After giving up 42 on the road last week to Puget Sound, Lewis and Clark played okay for the first 3 quarters. And believe it or not, at one point this game was 14-7. However, Lewis and Clark dominated the final 15 minutes to capture their win of the season. They have a now program record 6 straight wins over the Bearcats. And in the 4th quarter, Lewis and Clark outgained the Bearcats 174 yards to 19. When you dominate a game like this, of course your player of the game is going to be one of the big boys up front. Senior Ward Anderson had 5 tackles, 1 sack, and 2 quarterback hits. Williamette's player of the game was Laake Like. He had 8 tackles and an interception. Lewis and Clark's going to head to Dillon, Montana to play Montana Western next week. And Williamette will play Southern Oregon next week. On to your Linfield Wildcats versus Denison. In the first game of the year, Linfield wasted no time establishing their dominance. Actually, I lied to you guys. They wasted the first quarter. They ended the first quarter down 70-0, but then in the second quarter, Lincoln exploded for 21 in the second, and after that, the game was never the same. Linfield's player of the game, Connor McNabb, rushed for 161 yards and 1 touchdown, and Linfield's going to head to California next week to play Redlands University. On to our Idaho schools. Boise State Broncos played UCF, and they lost 16-18. Gut-wrenching. It's the only way to really describe a loss like this. Starting the year 0-2 is less than ideal, and it's worse when you think of the fact that Boise State is yet to establish an identity. Are they led by the defense? No. Are they led by an offense? No. Do you have at least enough confidence in your offense to say, hey, if our defense can hold them to 14 points, we can win this game? No, you don't. Again, Boise State needs to do something. I've said it once, I've said it twice, I'll say it every single time. When you don't have an identity on offense, when you can't run the ball and say, I'm going here, you will never win the big games. You have to be able to run the ball. You can be an air raid offense and throw the ball 70 yards, 70 times a game, have 500-plus yards. But when it comes to 4th and 1, and you need a yard, you need to know you can get that yard. It's not time to hit the panic button yet on Boise State. But if I have the button right here, I'm getting real close. Boise State's player of the game was Ashton Jeanty. He had 212 all-purpose yards, 115 rushing, and 97 receiving. Boise State's going to welcome North Dakota to the Smurf Turf next week, and what they hope will be win number 1 to start the year. Idaho Vandals versus Nevada. They won 33-6. Domination. What's the spell? Domination. Which is exactly what Idaho did against Nevada. I told everyone on the Pacific Northwest Sports TikTok that I expected Idaho to dominate this year. And they're doing it. This was Idaho's first win over an FBS team since they were demoted to FCS. Idaho won the turnover battle. Idaho had their way with Nevada's offense and the defense. And there's no way to say it, right? Idaho was just flat out better than Nevada in every aspect of the game. There's not one point in that game when you can look and go, Nevada has a chance. Idaho came in and laid the wood. Idaho's player of the game is Giovanni McCoy. Went 15 to 21 for 313 yards on 2 touchdowns. And you know what? If no one else is going to say it, I'm going to say it. Giovanni McCoy, he's the leader to win the Walter Payton Award right now. It's his award until he loses it. Idaho's going to head to Berkeley next week to play against Cal. I'm calling it right now. Upset alert. Idaho is winning this game. They're too good. Flip side, Idaho State Bengals played Utah State and lost 28-78. Wow. After a tight 7-7 first quarter, Utah State turned it on. They dropped 44 points. That's right, 44 points in the second quarter. This game was ugly, but there are some positives for Idaho State. The Bengals led the game in time of possession, first downs, and third down efficiency, and they also scored 28 points for the second straight week. This was the last FBS team Idaho State has to play this year. The Idaho State player of the game is pretty simple. It's Jordan Cook. He went 20 of 30 for 185 yards, a touchdown, and an interception. The Utah State player of the game, pretty simple as well, Cooper Legis. He went 14 of 16 for 125 yards and 2 touchdowns. Now, Idaho State will return to Pocatello, where they'll play Northern Iowa next week, and Utah State will play Air Force next week. On to the College of Idaho Coyotes versus Montana Western. Now, they won this game 37-35. Amazing. What an amazing game. Let's dive into it. Montana Western led after the first quarter 14-7. The Yotes were determined to bounce back and went into halftime with a tie game at 21-21. Anyone who was watching this game could tell, okay, it's going to be a close game. Now, the Yotes would come out swinging in the third quarter, and they quickly end up 31-21 heading into the fourth quarter. But buckle up, because this is where the game got crazy. The Bulldogs opened the fourth quarter with a DJ Curvin touchdown with 13:37 left in the game. Now, the Yotes ran off more than 6 minutes off the clock when they got the ball back, but they ended that with a 43-yard missed field goal. After this, the teams traded 3 and outs, leaving the Bulldogs to control the ball with 5:33 left in the game. The Bulldog offense kicked it into gear, and they drove down the field for another Norse touchdown reception, leaving the College of Idaho just 57 seconds in the game, trailing 35-31. The Yotes did the most of that, and they ended up with 5 seconds left on the clock. Sure, they could kick a field goal, but what's a field goal going to do when you only get 3 points and you're down 4? So Mike Morosky, another person we have a podcast coming out with in the future, sent out his quarterback and said, throw it deep. Well, he almost threw it too deep. Okay, because in that all too familiar mosh pit we're looking at in the back of the end zone where players are all trying to catch a ball, funny enough, as he was falling out of bounds, College of Idaho Yote tipped the ball inbounds. And that left enough time for senior John Schofield to touch the touchdown in the back of the end zone on an amazing toe tap touchdown. Yotes win. Now, the Yotes player of the game is John Schofield. Need I say more? Game-winning touchdown, OT. You're a senior. It's memorable. Montana Western player of the game is Michael Palandri. He went 16 of 24 for 244 yards and 3 touchdowns. You really can't ask for much more. It's a heartbreaking loss for Montana Western and an amazing game for College of Idaho. The Yotes, after starting 3-0, have a bye week next week. And Montana Western is going to welcome Lewis and Clark into town next week, hopefully for a nice win for them. On to Montana, boys. The Montana Grizzlies played Utah Tech, and they won 43-13. Call it what you want, but I call it a rout. The Grizzlies dominated from the opening kick against Utah Tech, scoring the first 43 points of the game on their way to what was that 43-13 score we said. The defense forced 4 turnovers, the offense rushed for 397 yards, and the final stats don't really even tell the story of just how much Montana controlled the game. The Grizzlies led 36-0 at halftime and 43-0 at the end of the third quarter, And outside of a pair of late touchdowns when their backups were in the game, Utah Tech didn't do anything, and Montana defense didn't allow anything. Montana's player of the game is senior running back Nick Azumoto. He ran it 12 times for 118 yards and 2 touchdowns. He averaged 9.8 yards per carry. Utah Tech player of the game, nothing. There's no way in which you can look at this game and you can find something good. I tried. Couldn't find a guy who deserved player of the game. Montana Tech's going to welcome Ferris State into town next week. And Utah Tech will head off to Flagstaff's Arizona to take on Northern Arizona next week. The University of Montana Bobcats played South Dakota State University and lost 16-20. Heartbreaking. That's how Montana State quarterback Sean Chambers described the game. And he was right. With 10:15 left in the fourth quarter, this game was tied 13-13. Buckle up, because here's where it's about to get crazy. The Bobcats forced a 3-and-out. Then MSU marched to the Jackrabbits' 2-yard line. A penalty pushed them back to the 7, and they kicked field goal to go up 16-13 with 2:04 left in the game. South Dakota State responded on the next drive that ended with a 35-yard screen pass touchdown. Now trailing 20-16, Sean Chambers, the Bobcats quarterback, led the Bobcats down the field. A false start ended up pushing the team to the 24. And on 1st and 15, Chambers fired a pass to the back of the end zone where Cleveland Thomas Jr. made the catch. The nearest official threw his hands in the air, and the clock read 0-0. Montana State just beat your reigning FCS champions in an amazing game. But wait, we need to review that play. Well, they did, and the play was actually overturned. Now the Bobcats had one last pass, but unfortunately it fell incomplete. The Bobcats player of the game was Sean Chambers. He went 3 of 9 for 53 yards and a touchdown, but rushing is where he made the real impact. 20 attempts, 92 yards, and a touchdown. The Bobcats welcome Stetson into town next week. Now, your Carroll Fighting Saints played St. Thomas University and won 26-23. For the first time since 2013, Carroll is 2-0 to start the season. A stunner of a game. Settle in, because this one's going to get wild. A Prika interception with under 3 minutes to play, down 7, spelled certain defeat for the Saints. This game was over. But Carroll's defense, like it did all game, held firm in St. Thomas's 5-yard line, forcing a punt from their end zone. Now, the Bobcats intentionally ran their punt out of the back of the end zone for a safety, and after 2 penalties on a play, they free kicked the football out of bounds at their own 10-yard line, handing the Saints a 40-yard field with 68 seconds to play and 1 timeout. That's all Carroll needed. 4 Bobcat penalties, a holding, an unsportsmanlike, a kick out of bounds, and a pass interference, set up a 26-yard shot to the end of the end zone from the right arm of Jack Prinka that Chris Alkushun used to cap his career day and send the Saints to 2-0. Carroll's player of the game, Chris Alkushun. He caught passes of 39, 38, 22, and 14, setting a new career high for him with 167 receiving yards. Carroll's going to head to Billings next week to play Rocky Mountain College next week. Hopefully, they can get another win and be 3-0. On to our Utah schools. BYU versus Southern Utah, 41-16. They won. A win's a win. Keaton Slovis went 22 of 32 for 348 yards and 4 touchdowns. True freshman LJ Martin led BYU in rushing again with 27 yards and 6 carries. The story's the same for BYU, though. They started slow. They ended the first quarter up 6-3. You can't do this. Luckily, BYU ended up scoring 27 unanswered points to close at the half, but this can't be a normal thing for BYU. They need to fix it. Like I said last week, I thought this week against Southern Utah was going to be a tune-up. I thought they'd get their offense back on track. I thought your running back would get fixed. I thought you'd say, hey, he's our freshman. We're going to have him lead the team. I thought Keaton Slovis would play better. but you ended your first quarter up 6-3 against an inferior opponent. There's no way to put that any other way than you didn't play well. You didn't. Plain and simple. And you have to play better if you want to see these games. Your leading rusher had 27 yards. Sure, it was off 6 carries, but you're playing against a team with less talent. Run the damn ball and establish your dominance. Say, I'm going to go here, stop me. But you can't, and they haven't yet. And when this happens, BYU is going to be looking at losses throughout the season because they don't know what they're doing. Now, BYU's player of the game was Keaton Slovis. Again, 22 of 32, 348 yards, and 4 touchdowns. Southern Utah's player of the game, Targi Lamson. 7 rushes, 32 yards, and a touchdown. Playing for a team that's offensive line wasn't anywhere near the talent BYU had on their defensive line, but they can still run the ball. BYU will head to Arkansas and play the Razorbacks next week. Southern Utah will head to Davis, California to play Davis next week. Then Utah Utes versus Baylor. 20-13 win. But it's becoming increasingly clear that when Utah doesn't have Cam Rising as their quarterback, this team struggles. The defense looked a little bit weak in the first half, strictly because their offense couldn't get anything going, so they couldn't maintain possession, so the defense couldn't get a break. The second half wasn't any better for the offense. In fact, if it weren't for the defense being so amazing, Utah loses this game. Quarterback Bryson Barnes shouldn't see the field for the Utes unless it's an emergency situation for the rest of the year. He just shouldn't. Luckily, Utah has a capable third-string quarterback who should now be second-string when Cam Rising comes back. But first, until that happens, Nate Johnson. Now, Nate Johnson is also Utah's player of the game. He comes off the bench. He goes 6 for 7 for 82 yards. We're rushing 11 times for 32 yards and the game-tying touchdown. Utah will play Weber State next week at home. Speaking of Weber State, bang! On the Wildcats' first offensive play, Kylan Weiser connected with Jacob Sharp for a 77-yard gain, followed by Damon Bankston scoring on a 2-yard touchdown run to give the Cats a 7-0 lead. Despite this, we went into halftime tied at 17-17. Early in the third quarter, the Wildcats intercepted a pass and returned to 15 yards, which set up a 9-yard touchdown, giving them a 24-17 lead. After that, they had a field goal to make it 27-17. Then after another interception, they broke off a 58-yard touchdown to clinch the win. Weber State player of the game, Damon Bankston. He rushed 22 times for 144 yards and 3 touchdowns. He also became the 33rd player in Weber State University history to surpass 1,000 career rushing yards. Weber State will play the Utes next week. Now it's time for the game of the week. Next week, the game of the week is going to be UW versus Michigan State. And I predict UW's actually going to win 38-24. Now, UW's going to take a dub in what will be their first of many future battles with Michigan State, depending on how division realignment ends up looking. But, like I stated earlier, I worry. What happens if this game turns into terrible weather and no one can stop anyone? Then what? You're looking at a lot of things that could go crazy. And maybe Michigan has tough coming, but he's not doing enough to come for this game. Again, if this weather turns ugly, we could be looking at a different type of game because UW is still yet to establish the run. Now, my player of the week. Sure, he didn't win his own player of the week, but it's Cam Ward, right? Dude willed WSU to a win, especially when it was almost guaranteed the Cougs were going to. And I hate saying this, but Cougan. I'll say it since no one else is going to. Cam Ward will make an invite to the Heisman Awards ceremony at the very least. That is my bold prediction for the year. Now, the upset of the week. Idaho. FCS teams beating FBS teams will always be a big thing. But it's the way Idaho did it. I mean, Nevada should be embarrassed, right? There's no way to look at this game if you're Nevada and say, oh, what? Find the positive in it. We scored against them. Okay. When FCS teams play FBS teams, the normal thing is that's going to be a really high scoring game because traditionally FCS offenses are able to keep up. It's the FBS defenses that are so stifling that make things hard, or the lack of FCS defense that makes the FBS offense run all over them. Idaho's been FCS for a while. It's not like this is a team loaded with FBS players and they got declassified and moved down to FCS involuntarily, which did happen, but those same players aren't there. Do not get me wrong. I think Idaho comes up and plays an FBS schedule. I think they go bowling this year. Watch out. The Vandals are going to keep winning, and it's going to be a crazy, crazy time. All right, guys. It's NFL season. It's time to give you an update on how your Seahawks played. Your Seattle Seahawks lost an extremely tough game today, 13-30 against the Rams. Now, defensively, the real issue you're going with here is that Kyron Williams and Cam Akers were running all over the defense. There was absolutely zero answer for the rush. And when that happens, quarterbacks like Matthew Stafford have the ability to sit in the pocket and pick apart your team just like he did today. He went 24 of 38 for 334 yards. Well, it's true he didn't score a touchdown. You have to be somewhat worried about that. Receiving, Puka Nacua was able to go for 10 receptions, 119 yards. Tutu Atwell went for 6 receptions for 119 yards. Something's got to be said about this defense, right? People were starting to say, hey, this could be a mini Legion of Boom. And yes, the Legion of Boom had their growing pains, but I don't remember them getting torched by 2 wide receivers in a game like this. Puka Nacua is the real deal, and I think he's going to have a very productive NFL career. And Tutu Atwell, well, I mean, he was an old second-round pick. People at this point were starting to label him as a bust. But then he goes out there and he does this against the Hawks, and it makes you wonder. As far as the Hawks go, I struggle to see a positive in this game when you were just taken over. Your highly anticipated rookie, Jackson Smith and Jigba, made his impression today with 3 receptions for 13 yards. And Geno Smith looked really pedestrian, going 16 of 26 for 112 yards and a touchdown. Well, that's an impressive feat. It's not what we're used to seeing out of Geno from last year. Yeah, it's mistake-free football, but if you can't do anything on offense, how are you going to help out your defense? Defensively, if you can't get a stop, how do you complement your offense? The Hawks are in a really, really, really tough position right now. That being said, they have all the time in the world to figure everything out. It's not like this is going to define their season. But you have to go into a Detroit team next week against the Lions, who is 10 times better than this Rams team. So you easily could be looking at starting off the year 0-2. From there, things get a little bit better, right? You have the ability to look at your battles with the Panthers, then the Giants, and then the Bengals, and then the Cardinals, and then the Browns. Right there, you could see 4 straight wins rattled off, but I think a lot of that depends on what you do with your defense and how you're going to fix issues like this. Let there be no mistake. Wagner had double-digit tackles, which you expect from him, and Jordan Brooks did his best coming back early from that ACL injury. But you have to get better production out of your offense, and your defense has to be able to step it up and take better care of your offense with good stops and being sure the offense has time to march down the field and do these things. Offensively, you have to hold on to the ball and control the flow of the game so your defense doesn't need to play all these tackles, doesn't need to play all these minutes. My name's Jay. Thank you for listening to Pacific Northwest Sports Week 2 Update. As always, please leave comments and let me know where I can improve so we can make this a community space and create an amazing weekly update. Have a great week.